This week on Africa Weekly, we focus on Liberia's long-standing land dispute, one of the key challenges facing George Weah's nascent presidency. We meet the first cohort of former rebels to join the National Army in Central African Republic. And we travel to Chad, where families are feeling the pinch of austerity measures. But first, a summary of the stories that made the headlines this week. Families of more than 100 Nigerian schoolgirls abducted following a Boko Haram attack on their school waited anxiously for news as the government announced that some of them had been found. The students went missing from their boarding school in Yobe State in northeastern Nigeria on Monday evening. The incident is reminiscent of the 2014 Chibok mass kidnapping, when more than 200 girls were abducted from their school in neighbouring Borno State. At least 17 people were killed when a mound of rubbish collapsed in a poor district of Mozambique's capital Maputo on Sunday night. The collapse is thought to have been caused by torrential rain, shifting loose waste, which then crashed down on the shacks and trapped sleeping residents. The government arranged for survivors to be transferred to a camp as a temporary safe zone, but some are worried about where they will live in the long term.
I'm waiting for help from the government. At least for the government to put my family somewhere, because the children are not going to school.
Thousands of Zimbabweans gathered to bid a final farewell to veteran opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai. Tsvangirai, who died on February 14th at the age of 65, was the country's fiercest opponent of former President Mugabe's 37-year rule. After 6 months of almost weekly marches demanding the resignation of Togo's President Faure Gnassingbé and for the presidential term to be limited to 2 mandates, the much-anticipated dialogue between the authorities and the opposition finally began. Although the start of talks has been hailed by the UN, the EU, as well as the ambassadors of Germany, France and the United States, many of the Togolese people remain sceptical that any consensus will be reached. And in Libya, thousands of people marked the 7th anniversary of the start of protests that ousted dictator Muammar Gaddafi, with rallies and concerts across the country. Yet divisions are still rife between the government of national accord and a rival administration backed by military strongman Khalifa Haftar in the east.
In this field in northwest Liberia, young palm oil trees extend as far as the eye can see, in place of what inhabitants of the neighbouring village were hoping would be a clinic or a school. The trees belong to the Malaysian company Siem Darby, one of 4 big palm oil producers operating in the West African country.
We all came here and told them, well, this piece of land we wanted for development. So we're begging people to leave this land for us for development. And how they left the piece of land. While we were negotiating what kind of development should come on the land, when we got ready, they said we should write.
In Liberia, the vast majority of land belongs by default to the state, which can grant companies concessions to exploit its resources. Taxes from palm, iron and rubber farms are a lifeline for the small, impoverished nation as it slowly recovers from 14 years of civil war. While villagers say the opaque nature of the contracts signed in their absence means they have little knowledge of what has been agreed, community leaders insist that the agreements are all above board.
Well, with that was done at the highest level, through our representatives and the senators.
A draft law aimed at regulating these practices has been in the pipeline for 4 years. If adopted, it would constitute the first step towards resolving a decades-old conflict over land ownership that dates back to the late 19th century when Liberia was founded.
These communities that have known to themselves over time that they own the land, but in actuality, under the legal framework, the land is not really theirs.
During former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's 12 years in power, several multi-decade concession agreements were renewed or changed hands, throwing new scrutiny on land deals. The government of new President George Weah is expected to reconsider the Land Rights Bill, which could impact the lives of millions of Liberians.
former enemies turned comrades. After 4 months of training, these ex-rebels are the first such group to be integrated into the Central African Republic Army. Over 100 young recruits from several armed groups took part in this pilot programme, with another 139 in training. The president himself attended their swearing-in ceremony.
You are no longer executioners of the people, or agents of disorder and illegitimate violence. Show the people of the Central African Republic that you are now the guarantors of their security.
Since 2015, the UN has been working with former fighters, encouraging them to lay down their arms in exchange for paid community work and other reintegration projects. Back in 2013, the country was pitched into turmoil when then-President Francois Bozize was overthrown by the mostly Muslim Seleka rebels. The Seleka in turn were ousted by a French-led military intervention, which was followed with bloody reprisals by the Anti-Balaka, a self-proclaimed, mostly Christian, self-defense militia. Years of conflict have left thousands dead and more than 1 million people displaced. Now, more than 4,000 rebel fighters have signed up to help reinforce security in their strife-torn country.
As we see it today, success is possible in Central Africa. This is an opportunity to renew this call by the head of state to all armed groups, to all those who have not yet accepted this hand that's been extended and this process, to listen to reason and join the Republic.
Despite a ceasefire agreement signed last year between the government and over a dozen armed groups, violence continues to flare up. Though UN forces have been unable to halt the killings, those taking part in the disarmament program say they want to help bring peace to their country.
It's time for me to serve the homeland so that our country becomes better.
Restoring peace won't come easily in a country where militias contest the control of different regions and resources. But those who have turned their backs on the fighting are hoping that others will be encouraged to follow in their footsteps.
Every morning, Diane goes shopping at the market, but for several months she's been coming back with less. That's because her salary as a midwife has fallen. In the last 2 years, she's seen it cut by 1/3.
We don't eat 3 times a day like before, we only eat once. In the morning we drink tea on its own with 4 fritters. It's not like before when the children had milk, chocolate milk, bread. There isn't any, and it's not easy to make ends meet.
Inflation makes Diane's pay cut worse. The price of some products has doubled.
Things are becoming more and more expensive at the market because they tax goods a lot when they get to customs. Taxes go up every year, which puts up prices at the market.
Since the end of last month, there's been widespread discontent across Chad. A general strike against government belt-tightening crippled the public sector. Hospitals and schools ground to a halt. Diane's husband says it showed the strength of feeling across the country.
In a country where the justice system is paralysed, the health sector is paralysed, the education sector is paralysed, I think nothing's working in this country.
Chad gets 70% of its revenue from oil sales, but since global oil prices fell in 2015, its economy has slumped, and there seems to be no let-up in sight. With public sector salaries eating up 80% of the state's budget, the government's borrowed nearly €2 billion from banks just to keep paying their wages.
With heroes like Superman, Batman and Flash, there are no limits to Emmanuel Chibuzor Ogoke's ambition. The parkour artist uses the Nigerian capital Lagos as his playground and hopes to launch his country's first ever stunt association. And next week we head to Nigeria, where over 30,000 refugees from Cameroon's English-speaking regions have fled the rising tension between separatists and government troops. That's all from us at Africa Weekly. Until next week.